We have one more almost mini workshop on produced water. It's going to highlight an effort with all the research universities and also a collaboration consortium with New Mexico State University and the New Mexico Environment Department. So our moderator for that session is Bob Sabie. He'll bring to us his experience in environmental planning. He has a master's in geography. He's working on a PhD in water science and management, with going all the way from sort of planning in his earlier years to some really high-tech remote sensing of water budget parameters. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Bob Sabie.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Sam. I'm Bob Sabie. I'm a research scientist here at the Water Resources Research Institute, and our last session of the conference, I believe, is this produced water research in New Mexico. And so this session is going to be broken down into two different parts. The first part is going to describe the New Mexico University's Produced Water Synthesis Project. And then the second part is going to be the New Mexico Produced Water Research Consortium. And so I'm going to ask each panelist to describe their specific research project and hopefully keep it between 8 to 10 minutes. And then at the very end, if we have any time, we can do some questions, because I know we have a lot of material to go through, but hopefully we'll still have a few minutes at the end to get a few questions in. So just to kind of get everyone on the same page before we get into the individual talks, what is produced water and what are we talking about there? And in New Mexico, it's defined as a fluid that's an incidental byproduct from drilling for or the production of oil and gas. And I think the emphasis here is on that it's a fluid and not water. And I think there's legal issues with how or whether it's defined as a fluid or a water, and Stephanie will talk about that in the next presentation. It's naturally occurring, it's highly saline water that's recovered during oil and gas production, and may also include fluids that were used during drilling, such as hydraulic fracturing fluids. And why this is important in New Mexico is since 2011, the oil production, in particular in the Permian Basin in the southeastern part of the state, has been increasing exponentially. Just kind of for context, New Mexico is the third largest oil producing state in the US, and Lee and Eddy counties in the southeastern corner of the state are two of the top oil and gas producing counties in the US. And so when the water that's in the geologic formations with the oil and gas is brought up, there's a produced water to oil ratio ranging anywhere from 3 to 1 to 13 to 1. So, if you think about bringing up 1 barrel of oil, and then the oil and gas companies sometimes have 13 barrels of water that they have to manage. And so in 2019, New Mexico, according to the Oil and Conservation Division, there's 163,000 acre feet of produced water that was generated. Or if you think about things in gallons, that was about 53 billion gallons of produced water. Of course, this water is high in TDS, high in salinity, or total dissolved solids. And so that ranges on the low end around 1,000 milligrams per liter up to greater than 400,000 milligrams per liter. And for context, seawater is usually between 30 and 35,000 milligrams per liter. So there's a lot of dissolved solids in this water. So the dispositions, the options for where the water goes after they bring it up, a lot of it is injected into underground saltwater disposal wells, or it's injected for enhanced oil recovery. And then more and more now, industry is trying to find ways to treat and reuse the water within industry. There's also evaporation ponds and offsite commercial disposal, discharge, and beneficial reuse, but those are less common in New Mexico right now. And I think Mike and Renee will talk about, or Rebecca will talk about those in a little bit with the consortium work. Of course, this topic isn't new in New Mexico, and this I've got a list of some of the collaborative projects that have happened over the past 17 years, but this is not at all exclusive, and there's been lots of individual research projects over the past couple decades on this, but these are just kind of highlighting some of the collaborative projects that have been going on. And in 2019, there's two parallel efforts that started. One of them is the New Mexico University's Produced Water Synthesis Project and the New Mexico Produced Water Research Consortium. And so there's kind of two main questions that are trying to be answered. Of course, there's a lot of different caveats to each of these, but the New Mexico University's Produced Water Synthesis Project, we're trying to assess what are the impacts of produced water management decisions on New Mexico's water budget. And the research consortium is looking at how treated produced water can be safely used as an alternative water source outside of the oil and gas industry. And so with that, I think that's enough background information to hand it off to Stephanie, and we can get into the nuts and bolts of these two different research projects.
Thanks so much, Bob. Just as an introduction, I'm going to give just a brief regulatory overview of what myself and then my two research assistants worked on, which was the analysis of the relationship between current regulatory legal framework and the Produced Water Act. So Sarah McLean has joined me today as well, and she'll be available for any questions at the end. So just a overview, produced water numbers. So as you can see this chart, which was information or data from OCD, is that in 2019, we had over 163,000 acre feet of produced water, which is about 53 billion gallons of water. To give you an idea about that, is the total maximum storage of El Vado Reservoir is about 180,000 acre feet. So here's this current state regulatory framework. So we know that the Oil and Gas Act established the OCD, and they have primary regulatory body to oversee the use or disposal of produced water in the oil and gas industry. OCD is a division of MNERD that regulates oil and gas activity in the state of New Mexico. Also, the OCC has concurrent jurisdiction and authority with the OCD to the extent necessary to, for the commission to perform its duties required by law. And so then we also have NMED, the New Mexico Environment Department, which is the agency tasked with protecting New Mexico's environment, resources, and public health and safety. And so then New Mexico Water Quality Act established the Water Quality Control Commission, and WQCC, they adopt water quality standards, but then they assign the responsibility for administering its regulations to the constituent agencies like OCD and NMED, just to give you a brief overview. And then we also have the Office of the State Engineer. So they have, of course, authority over the supervision, measurement, appropriation, and distribution of all surface and groundwater in New Mexico. And I just want to give you this brief overview because I'm going to be talking about the changes that the Produced Water Act had for these entities. Additionally, there's the federal regulatory framework. There's 3 tiers, as you can see in this graphic. So the federal law is the first tier. So we know the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, also known as the Clean Water Act, which established the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES permits that we might be more familiar with. And that regulates, the discharge of wastewater to water bodies that are considered on WOTUS, right? So we just heard about that earlier in the day, if you were listening to the presentations before. Tier 2 is agency regulations. And so EPA is the agency that's established for comprehensive rules for implementing the NPDES program. And so we know that some states issue NPDES permits themselves, But here in New Mexico, they issue them directly. Although, you know, based on Shelley Lemon's presentation earlier, you know, that's something that might be changing. So, you know, stay tuned, right? All right, next slide. So I'm going to talk about the UIC primacy. So that was the last point on my previous slide, which was the underground injection control program. So New Mexico has primacy for well classes 1 through 5. And I have that listed on the slide, the different well classes. The only thing that there is a caveat is that EPA directly implements class 2 programs for all tribes, except for the Navajo Nation and the Fort Peck tribes. But that's what's in the colored slide of the US. So 90% of produced water that's generated in the US is injected into underground geological formations through injection wells permitted under UIC Class 2 programs. So the federal delegation of the program is delegated to OCD, right, the Oil Conservation Division, and then WQCC, the Water Quality Control Commission, handles Class 1, 3, 4, and 5, although there are some caveats to that. So that's something that I'd be happy to explain that further, but just understand that it is regulated by the state through OCD and WQCC. So I'm going to get into the key provisions of the Produced Water Act. That was a primary analysis of what was the statute before and what has changed since the passing. So the Produced Water Act clarified New Mexico state agency roles and regulatory authorities. It went into effect July 1st and then fully this year in January. So as Bob was mentioning, produced water now has a clear definition. It's an incidental byproduct from drilling for or the production of oil and gas. And then there's a difference between treated produced water and recycled produced water. So I just you can read those definitions, and that is helpful, of course, with the next slide. One question a lot of people had was, is there going to be a new water right established through produced water? So the answer is no. So that's where the Office of the State Engineer does not require a permit for the use of produced water. It's considered a disposition by use, not a beneficial use. And it doesn't create a new category of water right that is perfected when water is treated, recycled, or reused. So that was made very, very clear. Also, the provision of produced water with is that OCD regulates produced water within the oil and gas field. Additionally, OCD now has authority to assess civil penalties to $2,500 per non-compliance with each violation, with up to a $10,000 cap, with up to $10,000 a day with a cap of $200,000. But that doesn't mean that a court in the appropriate jurisdiction can issue penalties if they're accrued over $200,000. And you can, if there was a violation that harmed an individual, such as a private party, they could also file a separate suit. So there's nothing in the Produced Water Act that prevents that. Additionally, something that is a lot of the individuals that are researching this is that the Oil and Gas Act, there was specific amendments through the Produced Water Act that there has to be a new disclosure and reporting of the water use of types of water in the completion of fracking, the fracking of a well. And so I've cited that specific statute because there are very clear rules now of how it's broken down of different types of water. So whether it's you're reusing the produced water, or it's saline water, or if it's completely just fresh water. It doesn't have to be the exact location of where that water is coming from, but what type it is. Also, the Produced Water Act encouraged the reuse of produced water within the oil and gas operations. So now it is against public policy and void if a contract entered between, two producers or a midstream company or what have you, if one of them requires fresh water. So I'm not saying that they can't use fresh water, the contract just can't require it anymore. If recycled water, treated or produced water is available and able to be used. Additionally, there's one more thing that just this last month, the OCC had a hearing on October 15th, where they agreed to set a hearing date for a proposed rule that would make spilling of produced water illegal. And so this was a petition by the Wild Earth Guardians. And you can look on OCC's website for more information. I'm happy to give you that, that citation. Okay, so this is where we get into what's going on, how produced water is potentially, treated produced water is potentially going to be used outside of oil and gas industry. So the Water Quality Control Commission is tasked with adopting water quality standards. So if we remember from the previous slides, they have to still delegate their authority though, when they make a regulation or adopt a standard. So that's where WQCC is going to be adopting these standards, and then NMED has authority to issue permits to use treated produced water if it's outside of oil and gas. But before this ever happens, these standards for treated produced water outside of the oil and gas industry are being developed through a two-phase process of that's NMED is leading. And I will let Director Roose explain this further, but I just want to give you a brief overview. So the first phase was public engagement by NMED, and that was joined with by MNERD and the Office of the State Engineer. And so they held 5 public meetings over the last, between October and November 2019, and that was all over the state. And so additionally, the second part of the first phase is the Produced Water Research Consortium. So on September 9th of 2019, NMED and the New Mexico State University agreed to identify and fill science and technology gaps associated with using treated produced water. This agreement created the Produced Water Research Consortium, which is led by NMSU. So the second phase of the implementation process will be to actually develop those science-based standards, and then formal rulemaking will occur. So formal rulemaking includes drafting the regulations that will then be submitted to WQCC. There will be public comment, and there will be a hearing. My understanding, there's no date set for when the draft regulations will be submitted, but I'll again let Director Roose address that. And that's all I have. And I'll stick around myself and Sarah for any questions once the other presenters are done. And thank you.
And next up is Martha Cather. And I just want to remind anyone that is out there that you can post questions in the chat. That way we can start to get the questions lined up if we have time at the end. So at any time, if you have a question, you can just post it in the chat. So Martha, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, I'm Martha Cather. I'm at the Petroleum Recovery Research Center here up in Socorro at New Mexico Tech. And I am going to talk a little bit about the New Mexico Produced Water Database that I've been putting together as part of this university's Produced Water Synthesis group here. And First of all, I wanted to talk a little, I'm going to keep my presentation a little bit short because I saw how many speakers there are, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the challenge and why, why does anybody care about a database of produced water? And the biggest issue is how can we actually even talk about using produced water or managing produced water if we don't know very much about it? Produced water is kind of a big term, and it catches a whole lot of things because there's water that's produced from wells. There is water that comes in from outside the system that's injected into wells. This is not as common as it used to be. There's water that gets recycled through wells as part of pressure maintenance or enhanced oil recovery systems. So it's important to know the location of space, where in space, if you're going to use water, where is it coming from? Not just aerially, but also what formation it's coming from. What is the depth? Because the geological formation the water may come from has a lot to do with what kind of water quality it has. So you also need to know about volume. How much water is being produced? People look at these great big volumes. I've seen this presented several times. There's this tremendous volume of produced water out there, but it's important to recognize this is a very dispersed source. And so individually, the little points that make up the production of this water can be separated by a few hundred feet, or they can be separated by miles. And so it's important to know where it's coming from. And then when it comes to injection, and I'll go to that a little bit further later, but you also need to know where is the water going. So essentially we're trying to get an idea of what is the progress of a water molecule from when it comes out of the ground to where it kind of goes down to its final disposition in some deep disposal well somewhere. So the disposition, is the water recycled, and is it used in the field for pressure maintenance or enhanced oil recovery? Is it reused for other purposes? Some of those have been listed before. Or is it disposed of down disposal wells? And then what is the variability of this water? If anybody's going to be treating it for any purpose, you need to know, does the volume stay the same sort of through time, or is it changing a lot? And does the quality stay the same, or is it changing? And that is both with water that's produced or with water that's re-injected somewhere. And then of course, the biggest challenge is how can we get and access that data more easily? So the effort that I put in this year mostly was to build the geospatial database of oil field water volume that can be and is now linked to existing produced water quality data. Then a second objective was to try and survey people who were in the industry as water managers in the oil industry to get a better sense from them about some of the things that won't show up just in the statistical data that is provided by the state of New Mexico or some of the other sources that we have. So the result of this is what I call the New Mexico Produced Water Database 2020. And if you know me or the research that I've been doing at New Mexico Tech, probably since about 2002, I have been involved in building water quality databases. And so there may be versions that some of you have seen out there, and I'd like to discuss a little bit about how this is different from the previous versions. First of all, in this particular database, I included 25 years of oil, gas, and water production and injection data. Most of this data is from the state of New Mexico, the Oil Conservation Division, and it's available from them monthly, but it's not easy to use. And the database that it produces is huge. It's gigabytes, and most people can't deal with that. So we've sort of extracted a bit of it and put it in a fairly commonly used database program that's Microsoft Access. It's big, but it's not unwieldy. It's not too big to use. So we have this water production, water injection data. We have a lot of information about the individual wells that are producing this water or where it's being injected. Things like spud date, when the well was drilled, what pool or formation it's producing from or injecting into, how many days it's produced or injected roughly in a year. That can be important if you're trying to figure out injection rates. So there's a variety of data that's associated with individual wells. And then we've included water quality data where we have it. There are at least 2 current data sources, relatively recent data sources, a version of the produced water quality database I put together back in 2016 with the WRRI's help, plus I believe the State Land Office actually helped me a little bit on that, or it might have been the State Engineer's Office. I get them all mixed up sometimes. Anyway, sorry. Also, the USGS, the United States Geological Survey, they have a large, huge nationwide data set, and I downloaded all the data for New Mexico and included that in this database. So there's 2 separate water quality databases. In many cases, they are duplicate, but I preferred to keep them separate because I simply did not have the resources to go through and cross-check and say, hey, this is duplicate data, let's delete it. So essentially, you've got 2 sources of water quality data. Cleaned up some of this data. Some of the issues with the USGS database were that it had a lot of wells that were either not really oil and gas wells or that had poor identification information. So you couldn't locate them in space. There was no latitude, longitude associated with it. I also included a few summary tables and some fields in the database that could be useful for aggregating and statistics. I'll show you a little bit of that in my next slide. And in some pre-built queries. My assumption is that if you're downloading this database, you have some inclination, some familiarity with access, but some of the queries, they're easy to build, easy to save, so I just left them in there. 2 things this is not, because there was a little confusion that showed up in my poster session yesterday. This is not a database of water spills, neither produced water or any other kind of database of spills. This is simply what is produced or what is injected. And this is not currently live. In other words, it had a finite cutoff date, and that's the middle of 2020. So there's no more live updates. However, this has been viewed as a stepping stone to getting some of this information up online. Then people say, oh God, databases are so boring. What can we do with this? Well, you can use it for just plain old statistical analysis. Run your queries at Access and then export that to the spreadsheet of your choice and graph away. Questions like how much water is produced or injected in New Mexico? What county, township, well, region has the most production, the most injection in a year or over its, I can't say over the lifetime, but over the last 25 years. Can we distinguish water injection or production versus water that is recycled through EOR projects? There's a whole lot of different questions you can do with this, things like water quality questions as well. Where's the best water, produced water in the state? What about the worst? How do ratios of things change through times? I thought this was an interesting little chart I just made up showing how the change of water disposed versus injection has changed from 2005, where a whole lot of this blue water, this is called injection wells. These are not disposal wells. These are generally wells that are used for water flooding, that's enhanced recovery, pressure maintenance, or other things like that. So back in 2005, that was the bulk of the water that was disposed of. Now there's a whole lot more water that is being disposed of down saltwater disposal wells. One of the things that I thought was kind of interesting that, you know, as I said, I've seen a lot of talks in the last couple of days where they talk about these billions of gallons and hundreds of thousands of acre feet. And that is correct. But once again, not all of the produced water is available. You know, you're not going to be taking all of that water out of the system. So essentially that last slide was showing that a lot of the water that's injected is actually being used already for some other purpose. Other things you can do, we can map this data because I included geospatial data in it. You can map things, individual points, wells, you can code them by whatever strikes your fancy. Bubble maps of production or injection volumes or rates, water quality, currently active wells. You could map all the wells that produced over 100,000 barrels of water in 2019, find out where those are. Or you can aggregate this. We've included some identifiers for townships and sections that match some of the easily available GIS data. So a few things here. This is just a sample of some things that you can do. And this shows kind of the injection wells. And so over here is only wells that are used for injection. Over here is saltwater disposal wells. And you can see that a lot of disposal is going on down in this part of the state. 12 wells that injected over 25 million barrels of water in 2019 for this particular township here. Over here, this is injection. There's a water flood going on over here. And so there's a lot of water that's been injected, but it's in 122 wells. And so, if I was looking for water to treat, I might be kind of looking down in this part of the state, just based on volume alone. And then going forwards, what we would like to do is get this static database put up onto our GoTech website. This is a data website that has been operated by the PRRC since about 1995 or so. And while it is not really beautiful or sexy in the way that a lot of modern day dashboards are, it works, and it has been working for a long time for simple volumetric data queries, things that a lot of our users have questions about. So the goal is to get this database up on GoTech, and then we can actually update it monthly with volume data. Other things that are in the works are collaborating with the Produced Water Consortium, Groundwater Protection Council, and New Mexico Bureau of Geology on creating different, I call them different implementations of this data, things like dashboards using by mapping applications or graphic data displays, possibly even making ways for operators to enter data into it. And then getting more of the water producers and managers on board to improve our data set. Data's old, some of it, water quality data is only up to 2014. We need to get more data. That means we need people who will share it with us, and also some of their usage practices. Because I still don't think you have a full understanding of the system just by getting the statistic data from the Oil Conservation Division. You really need to have a much more hands-on feel for where water is going if you're going to make a water budget using produced water. And I think I'll call it quits there. I probably took more time already than I needed to.
All right, thanks, Martha. Next up, we have Bruce Thomson from the University of New Mexico.
My collaborators are Janie Chermak in economics and Katie Zemlich in the Office of the State Engineer. The most important thing on this slide is my email address. Any questions, comments, suggestions, please contact me, bthompson@unm.edu. There's no P in Thomson. So I'd like to start my talks by just reminding us how important oil and gas is to the New Mexico economy and especially to state government. So we've got round numbers, a third of the state government is funded by revenues from oil and gas, and it goes to the universities and the schools and the hospitals and so forth. So we need to remember, whatever we do, that this is an important component of the economy of New Mexico. So what I've done in my project is I've taken all this data that Martha has referred to, mostly from OCD, an organization called Frac Focus, some from the state engineer, and Land Department, State Land Office. And I've taken a deep dive into it and tried to identify trends so that we can understand where the industry is going. And we've put a little bit of economics into it. And so if you look, and I don't know if you can see the cursor, but you look at the graphs in the upper right-hand corner. The first is annual oil production up in the southeast, and the southeast and the northwest. And you can see it's going asymptotically. It's really doing well, but it's dependent on the price, and the price is reflected in the graphs in the farther upper corner. And you can see that as the price of gas goes down, that the activity has dropped rather dramatically. And in recent years, so has oil, or in recent months, so has oil production. I think the state budget was based on oil at 55 or 60 bucks a barrel. And last I checked, it's about 40 bucks a barrel. So that gives you some idea. So we're interested in the explosion, particularly in southeastern New Mexico in the Permian, is because of development in unconventional formations, tight sands and shales. And along with that is directional drilling. So you can see there's some definitions or examples down there in the lower right-hand corner where you've got the horizontal drill, a directional drill that's following the formation. And you know, we make a big deal about fracking, but we need to remember fracking has been practiced for 70 years. In fact, fracking has been practiced in many water wells, particularly out in western New Mexico. So if we look at trends, and again, we're trying to understand where the industry has been and where it's going, following a little bit up on what Martha was talking about. And in 2019, there were almost 1,100 wells that were fracked. And the total volume, since we're talking to water resources people, I've converted it to acre feet. Total volume is 40,000 acre feet of water was used for fracking in 2019, according to Frac Focus. And just coincidentally, but to put it in perspective, 40,000 acre feet is the same volume of water that is consumptively used by the city of Albuquerque. Very large volumes of water. And it's also important to remember that water for fracking is generates a lot of revenue for farmers and water rights holders down, particularly in the southeast. They're talking about $1 a barrel, sometimes more. There is increased interest, this last large bullet, there's increased interest in using produce water for fracking. But the high salinity is a challenge, especially for slickwater fracs. And in the slickwater fracs are fracs where you use little or no gelling agents, and instead you use very high velocities. Some of these velocities are many tens of feet per second in the well bore, compared to 5 feet per second, which is maximum in your distribution system. So these are very large velocities. They add these friction reducers, and the problem is that in really high salinity water, these big long polymer molecules, clump up and they don't work. So the oil industry would like to use produced water. It's a way of getting rid of some of it. It's cheaper usually, and there's lots of it. But the challenge is with the real high salinity. And as Stephanie mentioned, we don't know exactly what the volume of water used for fracking is represented by produced water. It's somewhere in the 10 to 20% range, but that's just based on anecdotal conversations with folks in the industry. But this new regulation that was passed by the Oil Conservation Division will require that reporting. And it's sort of a shame we didn't do that about 10, 15 years ago, but it's going to be useful information. The one thing I wanted to point out, we talk about 40,000 acre feet of water used for fracking, and even if it's all fresh water, that is a very small fraction of the water used for irrigated ag and Lee and Eddy counties. And I understand this is a sort of a provocative sentiment because ag is a special part of the social and cultural history of New Mexico. But the volume of water used for fracking is relatively small compared to the total water use. So let's talk about produced water. And we usually lump produced water and flowback together. Flowback is the water that is generated immediately after a frac job that comes back to the surface in a few weeks or a few months at most, whereas produced water is generated through the duration of the life of the well. And my numbers are a little bit different than what Martha said, but on the order of 160,000 acre feet. So it's 4 times the volume of water that's used for fracking. It's a lot of water. And you can see in the graphs, the upper right-hand corner, the volume of produced water in the Permian, the green chart, is going. It's not increasing as rapidly as the oil production has. The volume in northwestern New Mexico is very small. What is interesting, and I think perhaps the most interesting statistic in my presentation, is the produced water to oil ratio. So back 10 years ago, it was around 10 gallons of water came up with every gallon of oil, and that has dropped. And most recently, it's down around 3 gallons of water per gallon of oil. And this is very dangerous. And it's, of course, nonsense. But if you take that line, it's a perfect straight line, and you extrapolate it, it says by 2025, we won't have to worry about the problem at all. It'll be zero. And of course, that's nonsense. But it is sort of interesting to look at that trend because it's remarkable. And why is it? Why do we get less water than, why is the ratio of water to oil less than it was several years ago? And the reason is that because we're going into these tighter and tighter formations, and because they have the low permeability, low hydraulic conductivity, they just don't release as much water. And we've talked about the very, very high salinity, which presents all sorts of problems. Not only is it a salinity problem, but it's also complicated water chemistry with, as opposed to seawater, which is 95% or better sodium and chloride. This has got calcium, magnesium, sulfate, silica. Sometimes there's hazardous constituents in there and so forth. Martha also touched on this, and again, we can look at the trend. This is how we dispose of our produced water. So the top line is the total volume of water that's injected. The green line is the water that is injected for principally secondary recovery, SRO, which is the water floods and so forth. And the red line is the water that is sent to saltwater disposal wells. And again, you can see a rather dramatic increase in the water sent to SWDs, saltwater disposal wells. And the reason is that as we go to these tighter and tighter unconventional formations, you can't do water floods. The hydraulic conductivity is simply too low. So this is my last slide, and I'm reiterating the problem that managing produced water is a major challenge. Fresh water for fracking is a relatively minor challenge by comparison, and as we learn to get better frac jobs with produced water, that problem will diminish. There is difficulty in permitting new saltwater disposal wells. They can be very expensive, particularly as they go to greater depths. I think Alex may talk about that a little bit. It's expensive. We're talking about Mike Hightower, who will present a little bit later, talks about $2 to $4 per barrel of salt water that's disposed of. Some of these wells, the saltwater disposal wells, cost up to $20 million, $20 million for one well. What's interesting is the payback. They at charging these large rates per barrel of water, they'll pay back in 1 to 2 years. Desalination of produced water seems unlikely in the near term. We'll have further discussion about that. And if it did, it would generate a huge volume of waste. This is the volume of waste. It's 500 feet tall and 1/3 of a mile in diameter every year if we desalinated all the water. And I propose that we take all that and convert it into a ski hill and charge the Texans to go skiing. My concluding thoughts is, more so than any other industry I'm aware of, the oil and gas industry responds very, very rapidly to economic considerations. They respond to the price of oil and the price of drilling and producing that oil. So the economics needs to remain as a fundamental consideration. I've cited my reference, which is the report that we just submitted last September to the WRRI. Remember my, my email address. If you have any questions or you want to talk about this further, please contact me. So thank you very much. And with that, I will stop my screen sharing. Thanks, Bob.
Thanks, Bruce. Next up, we have Alex Rinehart from New Mexico Tech.
Yeah, so this is going to be a little bit of a change in pace. So we've been hearing a lot about the data streams, and hang on a sec. We've been hearing a lot about the data streams and some policy stuff and things like that. This next talk is going to be basically entirely physical science, okay? And so one of the things that happens when you have produced water and you dispose of it into the subsurface and you don't use it, as Martha and Bruce talked about, to generate secondary recovery, but instead you just dispose of it into the subsurface, is that you increase the pressure in the formation you're injecting in, and that has led to seismicity, which I'm sure folks have heard about. And so this study basically pulls together data from Mary Litherland at the Bureau, who's a seismologist, and the work that Martha has done through Luke Martin and through Joseph Grigg and Raven Goswick in terms of using the database that she has compiled. And then linking the seismicity that Mary sees with the injection data and the geology, right? So Joseph Grigg is the geologist on this. I need to credit him a lot. He's put in a lot of work in terms of, lumping pools together and figuring out how to think about the geologic framework that surrounds the injection. And ultimately, as we'll talk about, controls the seismicity. So this is sort of a take-home slide. So over here on the right, we have all the saltwater disposal wells in 2020. And those are all the black dots. And here's Artesia and Carlsbad, Hobbs, Lovington. We have these lines here, and these lines are mapped by the Texas Water Board, I believe. And these are old faults that happened about 300 million years ago that cut rock up through the Middle Permian era, okay? And oftentimes with induced seismicity, the seismicity occurs along these old faults that are connected to the bedrock. And then over here, we have all of the earthquakes from 2017 through June 2020. And so we've been having quite a few earthquakes. They're low in magnitude, maximum magnitude something like 3.2 or 3.3. Most of these events are less than magnitude 2, so these aren't felt. Okay, these are very, very low magnitude earthquakes, but we have a bunch. Okay, so then the question becomes how or if we see any sort of correlation between saltwater disposal and earthquakes. Okay, I'm going to try that. There we go. All right, so to do that, we need to know a little bit about the geology in the Permian Basin. The Permian Basin are a bunch of shallow sea deposits that were deposited beginning in the early Paleozoic, and then I believe through the Permian, and then the seas rolled out. And basically we have three portions of the Permian Basin in New Mexico. We have the Central Basin Platform, we have the Northwest Shelf, and we have the Delaware Basin. The Delaware Basin is the deepest portion of it. These others are shallower. Oil and gas have been developed out of these formations, out of these regions for a long, long time, right? For 70 plus years. And the thing that causes a lot of these structures are those old faults, okay? And so that's why we have shallower parts of the basin on the Central Basin Platform and deeper parts of the basin in the Delaware Basin. So what are the rocks that make up the Delaware Basin? Well, we have a whole bunch of units, right? These are old rocks. We have, we have something like 20,000 feet of sediments, okay? And what Joseph Grigg did was he went through and he lumped all the pools. So, Martha's database has all this gorgeous detail in it. And then you need someone who's, careful and trained like Joseph to go through and actually figure out how to lump stuff together. You need a good geologist on the project. And so, he lumped together all the different pools into the different major formations. And then we went through and correlated the injection volume from saltwater disposal into the different formations. And when we look at this, this is about 3 billion barrels. This is historical, right? So this goes back a long time. This isn't just in the last 10 years. This is the total injection into what's called the Delaware Sands, the Bell Canyon, Cherry Canyon, and Brushy Canyon members or formations. So that's a big chunk. There is saltwater disposal in these deeper units in the Pennsylvanian and Permian. And then down here in the Siluro-Devonian, we have an additional 3 billion or so barrels of injection of saltwater disposal. And then below that, we have a little bit. Now, it's important to note that the Precambrian is down here. And for this particular well, it's maybe 2,000 feet below the peak injection horizon, the Siluro-Devonian that's deep. So when we think about this system, because it's not just two sets of units, we have a bunch. We decided to divide the injection horizons into shallow, which is all this stuff up here above the Woodford Shale, okay, where there is no injection. These are tight units and you can't actually inject into them efficiently. And then the deep units, which is the Siluro-Devonian and down. And so this is a large volume of water that we're going to think about in terms of shallow injection, in this case from 4,000 feet down to 16,000 feet. And then here, the Siluro-Devonian, which is from 16.5 down to 19 or so. Now, when earthquakes initiate with this induced seismicity along old faults, they oftentimes initiate in the Precambrian. So we expect a higher susceptibility to earthquakes with the deeper wells. And this is consistent with observations in Oklahoma, but things can be a little bit more complicated, right? So Mary Litherland, the seismologist at the Bureau of Geology, has been working very hard on actually monitoring the seismicity in the Permian Basin. And she runs a seismic network as well as the state of Texas and the USGS in the region. So when we look at the earthquake locations, we're looking at locations based off of this network, right? These are where all the seismometers are. And for various both historical reasons and geometric reasons, like where the stations are and how many components that they pick up, and the very low magnitude of the seismicity that we're seeing, she can get epicenters, she can get the surface locations, but it's really difficult to tell where, in terms of depth, the earthquakes are initiating. Okay, and like I said, that's both a function of the network geometry and the very low magnitudes that we have. So let's look at what has been going on in terms of earthquakes in the last 3 years. So in 2017, this is a map of the earthquake locations, and here's a time series with magnitude on the left-hand side. 2017 and 2018, we don't have a whole lot of seismicity in the Delaware Basin or anywhere in the Permian Basin. There's a little bit, okay? And it's mostly focused in this area, sort of southeast of Carlsbad, close to the Texas line. In 2019, we developed this cluster, okay? And we see that in terms of the number over here. We have more earthquakes happening in 2019. And then in the first 6 months of 2020, a bunch of stuff happened, and we had a whole bunch more seismicity that happened in the same cluster down here in the central part of the Delaware Basin. And then up here near Lovington and Hobbs, we had an additional cluster. And that cluster, there was a whole bunch of events that popped off in late June. And those events, that seismicity is ended, and MARI is deploying with Texas and the USGS more seismometers to monitor that, but I believe that it's stable right now. So when we look at this, we have sort of this shape, okay? We have a cluster up here, and then we have sort of a broad cluster down here. So let's look at the pattern of saltwater disposal. So we'll start out, and we'll just immediately separate the injection volumes into deep and shallow wells. And because it takes time for the pressure to build up, oftentimes there can be like a 5-year lag. We went all the way back to 2011. And so when we look at the shallow injection volumes and geometry, this is a 10-kilometer grid based off of the saltwater disposal wells. The geometry doesn't change a whole lot through time. You see a small uptick in production, not in production, in injection in the shallow wells in 2015. In terms of deep wells, we start seeing more injection happening deeper as we go through 2015, okay? All right, now 2016 through 2020, what ends up happening? Well, the shallow injectors, they stay about the same, right? We're not seeing any like large dramatic changes in the geometry or the volumes in terms of the shallow injectors. The deep injection ends up accelerating starting more or less around 2017 and then continuing to build through 2020. Remember, in 2020, this is just the first 6 months of the year. And so you could, extrapolate by multiplying these colors by 2. So we end up seeing both more wells, more area, being injected into and higher volumes in those areas. And when we sort of squint at this, we see, okay, there's a new cluster that's up here, and then there's sort of this grouping down here, and there's sort of, this smattering of wells through here, okay? So what does that look like when we put the earthquakes on top of it? Well, if we look at the total signal, right, total injection, it's kind of all over the place. There's not a clear correlation between total injected volume and earthquakes. And that's because of the shallow wells. Okay, the shallow wells don't correlate spatially or temporally with the seismicity. The deep wells, on the other hand, do. Okay, so the deep wells correlate both in space and time with the injection volumes, correlate in space and time with the increased seismicity. So we have quite a bit of injection down here in New Mexico. We don't know what's going on in Texas, so there may be injection south of the border in terms of saltwater disposal. And then we see sort of this gradation up here to this cluster here. And basically most of the places that we see deep injection, we have small amounts of seismicity. And there is some correlation with the old paleo faults, okay, but not entirely. This whole cluster here is in what we think is largely unfaulted. And so, faults seem to have some control, all right, but largely it's a function of if you have deep injection. And that's all I have. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Alex. I've been trying to get a hold of some of the panelists because I know that there's some time constraints with some people. So I'm going to ask Pei to go next. And then we're going to try to switch it up, switch the order for Pei, and then Rebecca and Mike, and then we'll end with Yanyan and Saeed. So next up we have Pei.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Pei. I'm at New Mexico State University. It's a great honor to participate in the panel discussion. I would like to briefly introduce the treatment of produced water for beneficial use. So from the previous discussions, we see that in the Permian Basin, we generate a large amount of produced water. And the question is, do we have, when we compare the produced water production and also different fit for purpose uses, how much water do we have? So this graph, it compares that the produced water production in the different basins. For example, in the Permian Basin, that is highlighted in blue, and it's highlighted in gray, and also compare it with the need of the hydraulic fracking that is highlighted. The bubble is in blue, and also the irrigation need. In 2017, the produced water generated in the Delaware Basin is about 43 billion gallons. And right now, in the Permian Basin, about 10% of the produced water is used for hydraulic fracking. But if we assume we can use 100% of the hydraulic fracking water from the produced water, that would be 24 billion gallons of water. We still have this surplus water that is 19 billion gallons of water that needs to be disposed through the saltwater disposal wells. And if we can reuse this water, it will meet the 10% of irrigation needs in the Delaware Basin. So it looks very promising that we can treat and reuse that water, but actually for safe reuse, we need to remove the contaminants depending on the water quality requirements for different applications. For example, we need to remove the suspended solids, oil and grease, and also the high salinity in the produced water can inhibit the beneficial use. And then we need to, depending on the application, we need to desalinate the water. And we also need to remove that the dissolved organic matter in produced water, such as petroleum hydrocarbons, volatile and semi-volatile compounds, the metals, dissolved gas, such as hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, and also the naturally occurring radionuclides. And Dr. Yanyan Zhang will present after me about the produced water characterization, and she will also talk about the toxicity of the produced water that we need to reduce before we can reuse the produced water. But when we treat the produced water, the cost is a big concern. The cost increases with the produced water's salinity, and also it increases depending on the level of the product water we want to achieve. So this graph, it shows that the different technologies we will use to meet the different fit for purpose applications. For example, to generate the clean brine for hydraulic fracking, for industrial uses, agriculture and groundwater recharge, or even to an extreme situation, some potable uses. And the cost of the treatment and the availability of the treatment technologies cost will increase, but the treatment technology will getting limited. When we have the produced water, the salinity increases. So, for example, if we just want to generate the clean brine for hydraulic fracking, we may need to use some simple physical and chemical separation processes to remove oil and grease. And we can disinfect the water using the UV or the chlorine, and also removal of iron for the hydraulic fracking. But when we increase the beneficial use requirement, for example, for agriculture uses or for groundwater recharge, we may have to desalinate the water. And the salinity of the produced water in the Permian Basin is quite high. The median is about 100 grams per liter. So for such a high salinity produced water, we may have to use the thermal desalination technologies, and then the cost will increase significantly. But on the other hand, when we think about the high salinity of the produced water, it may provide some opportunities to recover the resources from the water. For example, we can recover some minerals and also even the rare earth elements if they exist in water. So here we are looking into the treatment technologies that have lower cost and high energy efficiency. And we have already built a treatment technology database based on our previous projects funded by DOE. So through this project and also New Mexico Produced Water Research Consortium, we are conducting literature review to update the technologies we have evaluated in the past. And we are also working with the technology developers to request for information regarding the existing and emerging treatment technologies. So besides this effort at NMSU, we are also developing innovative processes for produced water treatment, pre-treatment, and the minerals recovery. For example, we are using electrocoagulation to remove the suspended particles from the water and then generate the clean brine for hydraulic fracking. And we are using the membrane distillation and also an innovative photocatalytic membrane distillation to generate the potable quality water for beneficial use. And also another option is to use the solar energy to evaporate the water and also generate the concentrate that we can recover the minerals from it. And Dr. Yanyan Zhang's group at NMSU is working on the chemical precipitation of the produced water to generate the struvite as fertilizer, and also developing a new technology induced by the microbes for the calcite precipitation. So you may already attended the poster presented by Lin Chen, a PhD student. We are working on the rare earth elements recovery from the produced water using the solvent extraction and ion change purification processes. So this is a very high level, brief overview of the technologies we are working on for the treatment of produced water for beneficial use. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at pxu@nmsu.edu. Thank you so much.
Okay, great, thanks, Pei. I think we're gonna switch gears into momentarily into the Produced Water Consortium research. We're gonna start that off. We'll shift back and end with Yanyan and Saeed, but for now we're gonna switch to Rebecca from the Environment Department.
Thank you, Bob. It's really a pleasure to be here. Hi, everyone. And thanks for being flexible and switching up the order here so that I can interject a little regulatory policy perspective overlay to the really great technical presentations that we're hearing. It really is very handy to have the great overview of the technical research that's being done in the state, the amount of expertise that we have. And I'm going to try now to share my screen. I will go through just a couple of quick slides as my goal. So jumping right in, just wanting to kind of hit the highlights of where does the Environment Department fit into this whole great discussion about the research that's being done. And this will tee up, cue off of some of the points that Stephanie made earlier. So from the Produced Water Act, the Environment Department clearly has jurisdiction over treatment and use of produced water for purposes outside of the oil and gas sector. That's really first and foremost where we come into this conversation. But I want to add an important caveat to that. Even though jurisdiction over in-field recycling of produced water for fracking is not under NMED's jurisdiction, it's not under our regulatory purview, we are 100% on board with the policy objective and value of, first and foremost, recycling and reusing as much of this water, this produced water in the oil field. And so we work closely with our colleagues at the Oil Conservation Division to that end, and support those provisions of the Produced Water Act that do help to incentivize and drive more in-field recycling. But when we're coming into the conversation, when you're hearing me talk about produced water, more than likely you're going to be hearing me talk about the path from where we are right now to potentially getting to authorized uses of treated produced water outside the oil and gas sector. The Water Quality Control Commission is charged with adopting regulations. NMED will be the department that essentially drafts those regulations and presents them to the commission. And I think this piece is really important as to how we get into the research realm that we're in right now, that NMED is so invested in through the Produced Water Research Consortium. When the Water Quality Control Commission adopts any regulations under the Water Quality Act, they're required to consider the things on this slide. I'm not going to read it all to you, but it's really important to note that there's a tremendous amount of rigor, rightly so, to ensure that the water quality regulations that we put in place in the state protect water quality, protect wildlife uses, protect the public interest, and a number of other factors, and take these things into account. And so these are some of the really overarching guiding principles that when NMED considers our task in ultimately developing draft regulations that would be presented to the commission, we need to keep these things in mind. And so one of the things that the department discussed right away when the Produced Water Act was passed and went into effect was that we, as a regulatory agency, do not believe that we have the science in front of us to develop science-based rules to propose to the commission for permitting the off-field, outside oil and gas uses of treated produced water. And so we set out this phased approach. Phase one really is, both of the phases are about rulemaking. It's how we talk about it. Phase one is potentially some near-term rules that would just kind of fill some of the space right now while we're waiting on the science to come in to clearly demonstrate that untreated produced water use outside the oil and gas industry is a no-go. That's prohibited. We also are considering if there's a way for us through rulemaking to increase the amount of information that's available to NMED coming into the department to ultimately further inform our phase two regulations. And that piece of that phase one rule, whether we ultimately end up with rules or we find another way to go about this, it's so important because as a regulatory agency, we can't regulate something that we don't know is out there. We can't protect our water resources from potential contamination if we don't know what's in the water being used and treated and reused. So that's an important piece, and it certainly is complementary with a lot of the efforts that the consortium is doing as well. And then the phase 2 would get into the rules for the discharge, handling, transport, storage, recycling, or treatment of produced water or their byproducts outside the oil field. So that's a quote from the Produced Water Act. That's ultimately what we come back to as our charge. And we are committed to making any such rules based in sound science, and we aren't there yet. So the timeline for that is TBD. Which brings us to the consortium. So the Produced Water Act was passed. It went into effect. We took a look at it. We took a look at what we know. We took a look at what we don't know in the state, nationally, and we partnered with New Mexico State University through a memorandum of understanding, and I'll come back to that other slide in just a second. Through an MOU that we entered into last September, and the consortium really started to kick off last fall with Mike Hightower coming on board as the program director and casting a net to recruit experts from many different sectors. And this was very important to NMED in partnering with the university to set up this consortium, that it draw on expertise from a range of views, perspectives, and sectors. So we've got amazing experts from academia. I think Mike can correct me, but something around 11 or 13 different universities or institutions of higher education, experts from environmental organizations, government agencies, state and federal, several states, and industry as well, and midstream companies and water treatment companies. So tons of expertise came together. And since January, the consortium has been working to advance the process of filling these critical science and technology gaps. And NMED is glad to be involved as a core partner. And I actually chair the Government Advisory Board, which is made up of 11 or 12 representatives of state and federal agencies. And we support the technical research that is happening within the consortium. So we're very invested in that. And while we're focusing right now very heavily on our partnership with the consortium and really making sure that the research moves forward in a way that will allow us as a regulatory agency to down the road rely on that data that comes out of it and the findings. We're also doing a few other things. We have focused on public participation. And as Stephanie mentioned earlier, we held a number of meetings last year, and we've put out a few resources this year in 2020. We've got a set of FAQs on the website that is not just NMED specific. It's broken up into some questions related to our role. There's a set of questions related to the Office of State Engineer, and a set of questions and answers related to OCD. So that's a handy resource and informed by a lot of the questions that came up during our public outreach last fall. And then under public engagement meeting materials, we have a summary of what we heard during those meetings that's very detailed. And if you're wanting after this technical panel today to understand better, like get your finger on the pulse of what do our fellow New Mexicans think and feel, what questions and concerns do they have, what interests do they have in produced water, that summary document from early September of this year is a great resource. So we're going to continue to keep our eyes and our ears open, continue to engage in conversations like this, continue to engage with our partners at other state agencies and the great researchers that are actively focused on these issues. And we are looking to, at the last bullet of this slide, really looking to the results of these efforts to inform our future science-based regulations for the treatment and reuse outside the oil and gas sector. And all the while staying very, very keenly focused on our mission to protect our precious natural resources and protect human health along the way. So that was I talked very fast. I hope that wasn't too fast, but Bob, I will turn it back over to you.
Great, thanks a lot. I think next up we have Mike Hightower, and I think he was having some technical issues earlier, but hopefully we got those resolved where he can call in and still do his presentation.
I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk about the consortium. My first slide just gives some background. I'm the program director, Peju, from New Mexico State is the research director. The consortium has about 60 participants, 160 or so technical experts and from a broad set of sectors from government, industry, academia, NGOs, producers, and midstream companies that participate in the consortium. So we've made a lot of effort to go out and actually bring in a broad spectrum of support and input into our research program. I know this is focused on research. The consortium spent the first 6 to 9 months really looking at analysis of some of the issues: water quality, water quantity. What are the methods to measure that? What are some of the general technologies that people are interested in? So we haven't done research as of yet, but we are planning to move forward with that. So I'm going to talk about really the reasons for the need for the research and the directions that we will pursue, and opportunities for the state of New Mexico, and why we think some of these directions are appropriate. So that my second slide is really focused on just setting the stage of why we're seeing around the U.S. a lot of states moving toward this opportunity to utilize these non-traditional water resources for beneficial reuse, whether that's for industrial applications or other types of applications. But part of that is because if you look at the United States, we're kind of essentially tapped out on fresh surface water availability. We haven't built any new large reservoirs in 30 years. All of our major groundwater aquifers have been impacted by overpumping and mismanagement, if you will, especially in the western U.S., where we are and where a lot of the oil and gas production is. So those kinds of issues are driving EPA and DOE and other federal agencies like the Department of Interior to look at major initiatives around reuse of non-traditional water resources. The next slide, the third slide here, just gives a bigger driver. If you look at climate change issues and climate history, that we're in a very severe arid cycle. Most of these arid cycles last 300 years in the mid-latitudes, and we're about 150 years into this current arid cycle that started really back in about 1850 to 1860. And so not only don't have a lot in our savings account from available freshwater, surface or groundwater to address these issues and more aridity over the next century or so, we're going to have to look at other resources. And we've seen in the past when we have these large stresses with low water availability, it's led to a number of historical sites to be abandoned, anywhere from the Mideast and Petra and the Anasazi and Chaco Canyon, Angkor Wat. And so we're kind of looking at, we don't want to be the next abandonment, so we need to look at these alternative resources. The fourth slide just talks about that the EPA and, as I said, other federal agencies are working together on this new initiative started in 2020 in February, essentially the 1st of March into February, on a National Water Reuse Action Plan, the RAP they call it, based upon looking at water stress across the U.S. And out of the GAO report from 2014, what it shows is most of the states are showing either local or regional water stress and issues. And so the driver of looking at these non-traditional water resources as the next supply of potential water supply. And that's why you see a lot of organizations, water organizations, talking about One Water. The fact that wastewater is going to become, with treatment, a new water supply. So the fifth slide just shows the kind of the focus of the EPA program, and you'll see down there the fourth one is produced water. And because of the work that New Mexico has done in the past on produced water, Bob mentioned that New Mexico's been looking at this closely since early 2000s. WRRI was involved with a study in 2003 on a statewide produced water reuse program, and there's been a lot of work in New Mexico since then on that. Our consortium and the state of New Mexico have been asked to work with the Groundwater Protection Council to kind of lead the activities associated with this national program on produced water for the EPA. So I think that's quite an honor. We take that seriously. We have an MOU, Memorandum of Agreement, MOA, with WPC right now, working on some of the areas Martha mentioned, water quality data, database information for public access. So my next slide, it just really gets to the heart of why treatment is being looked at. Bruce mentioned that the produced water has a lot of constituents. A lot of them are very high salt content, which is not amenable to a lot of desalination technologies. But there are a lot of places where we see within produced water that some types of treatment are going to have benefits to the state of New Mexico. And if you look at a lot of applications for pre-treatment where they're treating the produced water just for use inside the oil and gas sector, as Rebecca mentioned, that has advantages for the state of New Mexico as far as water supplies, including the fact that it could eliminate the need for fresh water for fracking. So there's a movement in a number of states to look at these pre-treatment standards as a way to eliminate or reduce freshwater use in the industry. If we can do some treatment, and in many cases people are looking at partial treatment because Bruce mentioned the large amount of salts associated with full treatment of produced water, but reclaiming some of the water, not getting all of the solids out, would allow you to utilize some of the water and still reduce disposal volumes. So it addresses some of the earthquake issues that were talked about by New Mexico Tech on the earthquakes, so even some of these different types of treatments that may not be full desalination of the produced water still can have a number of benefits, both for mineral recovery, which Faye talked about, to additional resources that could be utilized, reduction in earthquakes, and reuse inside oil and gas. So I think a lot of the treatment technologies that people traditionally use could be available for parts of this and provide us with an opportunity for additional water resources to address some of the climate change issues that we're seeing. My next slide, which is the next to last slide, it really shows some of the trends we're seeing within the oil and gas industry. And the big trend, and I've got three qualities of water there. In New Mexico, we have really three types of produced water. Some very clean produced water that comes from the Raton Basin, that comes from coal bed methane. It's in the 3,000 TDS range, and sometimes a little bit better than that. Then there's a lot of conventional produced water from conventional oil and gas that's in the 35,000 TDS range, which is around seawater salinities. And in those cases, for those qualities of water, reverse osmosis and some other types of technologies do work pretty well. There are some issues with suspended solids and oils and greases that become issues in fouling, but for some of those waters, those kind of technologies are available. And as has been mentioned before, as we get up to more unconventional waters, we're looking at 200 to 250,000 TDS in some cases, which really will require something on the order of thermal technologies, which in the past have been very, very expensive. But the point is, even as we look at some of the high costs for some of these treatment technologies, what we've seen is a huge increase in disposal costs for the oil and gas industry. And when I was working on this in the early 2000s, we were looking at 8 to 10 cents a barrel, which works out to be something, as you see at the bottom there, $2 a thousand gallons. And in those days, treatment of brackish water was $4 to $5 a thousand gallons. So it was not economical, definitely not economical 20 years ago. But fast forward to 2020, where we're looking at current disposal costs of somewhere around 50, 75 cents a barrel to $2 to $3 a barrel. So we're looking on the order of 20 to 50 or 20 to $80 per thousand gallons. Even the thermal technologies have an opportunity to be potentially cost effective there. So I think what we're seeing is this kind of change in the target that we're trying to meet. Very difficult even 10, 15 years ago to meet some of the disposal targets, but with the large volumes of disposal and the reduction in disposal space with saltwater disposal wells, the costs are going up. Higher pressures, deeper wells that are causing more and more problems with earthquakes. So the kind of the drive is the more water we can reuse on the surface, the less we can dispose of, the better off we're going to be from both an economic and environmental standpoint. So I think that you're seeing these different levels of treatment and applied different ways for different types of waters and different applications is going to be the trend. I don't think that there's a silver bullet out there, but I think that some imagination in how we put these treatment trains together and selection of which produced waters we go after to treat and how we treat them has some benefits for the state. And I just want to show this last slide. This slide comes from Bruce Thomson. I'm going to give him credit. He's from UNM and we're from New Mexico State, so we don't want to give him too much credit, but I want to make sure that he does get credit for this. He mentioned the fact that the state gets 30% of its revenue or a third of its revenue from oil and gas. But I'm really interested in what Professor Chermak at UNM Economics Department has come up with in looking at the social and economic benefits of utilizing produced water for uses in the state. And you can see at the very bottom, I've kind of pointed out that there's a broad range of what she has come up with, but all of them are positive. There's really nothing in there in her evaluation that says that this could be negative. It would be if we can't treat it to a standard that is protective of public health and safety. But the point is, even at the lower range, some of the numbers that you get with the volumes of treated produced water that we might be able to utilize, which is on the order of 1 or 2 Albuquerques a year, that's a lot of produced water and has an opportunity for some large socioeconomic benefits to the state. So I think what we're trying to do is identify in the next couple of years as we move forward what type of treatments make the most sense for which locations and which produced water types and qualities, and how can we maximize our ability to utilize that water for our best uses and improve the socioeconomic opportunities for the state of New Mexico, whether that's for industrial economic development or for other applications. So that's my presentation, kind of a summary of where I see the consortium moving and the interests we have in treatment over the course of the next couple of years. Thank you.
All right, great. Thanks, Mike. We have two more presentations. The next presenter is Yanyan Zhang from New Mexico State University.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yanyan Zhang. I'm an assistant professor from Department of Civil Engineering at MSU. Today, I'm going to talk about the produced water characterization project conducted by Dr. Pei Xu, Dr. Casey Carroll, and myself. As you know, some constituents of the in the produced water may pose significant impact on public health and the environment. That's why we are conducting a comprehensive assessment of produced water quality for safe disposal and beneficial reuse. We collect some produced water from salt water disposal in permit basin. We also collect some environmental sample in order to check whether the activity of hydraulic fracturing and produced water disposal have impact on local environment. So the environmental sample we collected include river water from Pecos River, groundwater from a local ranch well, and tap water from a local restaurant. So we are using advanced analytical methods to characterize inorganic, organic, and radionuclide material in the produced water. So we found salinity is very high in the permit basin with a TDS of 90 to 120 grams per liter. Sodium chloride is a major contributor for the salinity. We also have calcium, magnesium, and strontium cause the high hardness of the produced water. High concentration of sulfites in the produced water can cause the chlorine problem when we reuse those produced water. We also have high concentration ammonia can cause the toxicity. If we want to do the beneficial reuse for agricultural irrigation, we have to get rid of the boron in the produced water. So we also found the toxic organic compound in the produced water, including phenols, BTAX. So of course we have to get rid of oil and gas before reuse. Arsenic is the main heavy metal in those produced water. We also have to pay attention on the radioactive material such as alpha particle, beta phantom emitters in the produced water. They have very high concentration. We use metagenomic sequencing to identify the main bacterial contributor for the chlorine. So we found anaerobium is the main bacterial cause of the chlorine. We also developed the advanced toxicity assay to evaluate the risk of produced water reuse and disposal. So we were using luminescent bacteria, freshwater algae, and fish cell line to evaluate the risk. So the good news is for all the environmental sample we took, all of them meet national recommended water quality criteria. So next, we try to link the toxicity assay result with the chemical component in the produced water. So here I'm showing a figure indicating salinity, organic compound, and heavy metal. All of them contribute to the toxicity in the produced water. So after identifying the major chemical component contribute to toxicity, we can develop treatment technique targeting those compounds. So the result from this project can help us to explore potential beneficial reuse of produced water, including hydraulic fracturing online, and also some other industry reuse, including miner and power plant. So we can use the produced water for road construction and dust control. And after do some desalination, we can do the agricultural irrigation, some rangeland rehabilitation, some environmental reclamation use, and groundwater recharge. So that's what I want to say today. I will stay here until end of panel for any question you may have. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next up, we have Saeed.
Hello, everybody. My name is Saeed Langarudi. Our team, including myself, Sabie, Babak Bahuddin, and Sam Fernald, aims to synthesize the ongoing research efforts that we just saw in previous talks and integrate them within a coherent, accessible, analytical framework. To achieve this goal, we will develop a hybrid simulation model that can address some of the pressing issues of produced water management. As my colleagues described in the previous presentations, how the produced water is managed could significantly affect our ecological and societal systems. These effects, in turn, will have profound impact on our water system. Previous talks described how each of these effects could be measured and analyzed. However, to have a complete picture of how these effects impact our water system, we need to find a way to synthesize and integrate these research efforts, but this is not easy. As we saw earlier in this session, the produced water management problem has multiple levels of complexity. It is complex because it is dynamic, spatial, and involves heterogeneity. The problem is dynamic because the system evolves over time. Oil production, for example, water use for hydraulic fracturing, decisions for treatment and disposal, etc., all change as new decisions are made or new regulations are set. The problem is spatial because producers and regulators rely heavily on spatial information. Managers must make decisions for where to dig a new oil well, for example, where to dispose the produced water, where to inject treated produced water, etc. These geographical distributions change over time as decisions change. The problem is heterogeneous because agents representing stakeholders or wells act differently based on different inputs. Different analyses, different interests, all change the dynamics. To model such a complex problem, we need research methods and tools that can characterize and represent nonlinear system level as well as heterogeneous and spatial interactions over time. There are two different dynamic simulation methods that we can use to achieve this goal, system dynamics and agent-based modeling. System dynamics is an equation-based approach that characterizes a problem in terms of stocks and flows and represents its dynamics through accumulation and feedback. Therefore, it is a very suitable method for modeling water dynamics of water systems. Agent-based modeling, on the other hand, is object-oriented and characterizes the problem as a set of simple individual rules. This kind of modeling is suitable for network analysis or when spatial dynamics is important. We need to combine system dynamics and agent-based modeling in order to capture all the important complexities that we discussed earlier. However, use of hybrid system dynamics and agent-based modeling is a very, very young research area with little established guidelines. Our literature review identified that only 77 papers are relevant to hybrid system dynamics agent-based modeling. Among these papers, only one was on the topic of energy-water interactions, and only 31 papers show some details about how a hybrid model could be built. Therefore, we don't have much to start with, and it sounds like that our effort is more like an exploration, and we are trying to break some new grounds here. We started to conceptualize our model, therefore, using interviews that we have had with subject matter experts. What you see here is only a rough draft, just a work in progress conceptualization. However, it shows how we are planning to use the knowledge that has been created by our New Mexico universities and how we want to integrate it in a comprehensive simulation tool. All the synthesis research teams will participate in conceptualizing and formulating the tool. The team also provide inputs to the model in form of geospatial specification of the variables, parameter values of the model, external scenarios, for example, climate, economic, or population projections, and data that we can use to calibrate the model. Utton Transboundary Resources Center, represented by Stephanie Russo Baca, will provide input that will feed into the regulations and institutional processes of the model. This includes the mechanisms for how institutions update policies and regulations based on regional and local evaluations and public perception. Bruce Thomson from UNM and Martha Cather from Petroleum Recovery Research Center will help us to gather many different time series and data, as well as working knowledge of how the oil production, fracking, and produced water production work and how they will impact the system. Bruce in particular, hopefully will give us advice in the model formulation phase also. Our New Mexico State University team will provide information about how treatment technologies are selected and how they will impact water quantity and quality. Pei Zhu will lead these aspects, while Yanyan, Zhang, and Casey Carroll will provide information for environmental pollution of different technologies. Alex Rinehart's research at New Mexico Tech will provide information about the seismicity probability influenced by different produced water management decisions and activities. And finally, our Water Institute team will provide the hydrology expertise, data, and models to formulate the water submodel. We can see here that once different pieces of the puzzle are put together, we will have a very complex feedback system that will be very hard to model and analyze using traditional approaches. So our next step is to work on the technical challenges of creating a hybrid system dynamics agent-based model. We will also continue our interviews with subject matter experts and industry managers to unveil the decision processes and feedbacks that rule the system. Then we will parameterize and quantify the model, which will enable us to predict the produced water management impact on the water system at local and aggregate levels. The model can also recommend some, successful produced water management strategies, hopefully. Thank you very much. That was talk. If there is any questions or comments, I'm happy to take them. Bob?
All right. Well, thanks, Saeed, and thanks to all the presenters on this panel. I know thanks to everyone for sticking around. I know we went over on time, but this is a lot of great information, and it was good to hear from everyone. Because we ran over so far, if there's any questions that anyone has, I do know that all of our panelists are more than willing to answer those questions through email. So if you need anyone's email address, you can email me or Mark, and I'm sure we can connect everyone to get any of those lingering questions answered.